This is Angela Greenwood, an educational psychotherapist and the author of this book, Understanding, Nurturing and Working Effectively with Vulnerable Children in Schools, Why Can't You Hear Me? And it's full of gems really and wisdom of practical advice and support around supporting children and young people at any time, and it has a huge relevance for the current situation that we're in as well. So very warm welcome to you, Angela, and apologies for your technical difficulties this morning.
Well, my apologies to everyone listening. I'm sorry if I've, delayed you to say the least, if not disappointed.
No, it's good to have you.
Here I am.
Angela, I wonder if I can hand over to you in the first instance, just to perhaps outline some of the topics and aspects you were hoping to reflect with us on this morning.
Well, I want to acknowledge that everybody, adults and children, will be having difficulties at this time. It's a very strange time, and I'm sure that that's been spoken about a lot of times on this programme. Just a few things. Apparently domestic violence is up, and the divorce rate, I heard, has risen by 50%. So I'm just thinking of children in those families where there's already conflict. I guess my particular interest, which I address a lot in the book, is for vulnerable children, those who don't have the secure background, because I do think there will be some children who will actually be doing fine, those from very secure, sensitive families with parents, maybe at least one parent who's not working, and they're having home education galore, and I've certainly heard of cases like that. But I think large numbers of children, and especially vulnerable children, will be having acute difficulties and responding in all sorts of different ways, really. I was thinking that we all have our tendencies, which we revert to at times of difficulties. And I certainly notice that in myself and in my family. You know, some people close up a little bit and some people act out more. And some people get extremely anxious. People might even get psychosomatic symptoms. So there'll be lots of issues of fear and anxiety in both children and adults' minds as they return to school. But I think that the teachers and the school staff will be aware of that. It's a question of coping with it and being self-aware and knowing when you need a little bit of break. And also, the thing I really wanted to emphasize in this webinar, and I'm not sure how much time I will have now, is that teachers can and need to support each other. And senior management, SENCOs, people in school to support children, and of course you as educational psychologists who are there and available on a I don't know, daily basis perhaps, for people to call in when they have children who are showing signs of finding things difficult. And in fact, I did make a list of the sort of behaviours that you might observe in children who are struggling as they return to school at these difficult times. For example, regressing to an earlier anxious behaviour. I mean, I think I talked last time about my grandson who regressed to his dinosaur roars, but other people can regress in different ways. They may stop talking, or they may have outbursts, or the outbursts may last for longer, which would be extremely difficult for the parents and also for the teachers when they've got other children to cope with. Another thing is that, especially with the little children, because it's the years nursery, reception and year 1 and also year 6, but the little ones will have had and developed a very close relationship with their teachers and the staff in their classes. And, you know, many of them would have found the school a very secure base. And now they've lost that, and now they need to regain it. And this is going to be difficult because it's going to be difficult for them to trust. First of all, they would have heard perhaps from their parents that this virus is very pernicious and is easily transferred. And so they might worry that going to school will put them at risk. They might catch the virus, they might get ill, or they might find it difficult to relate to their teachers because they haven't seen them for a long time and they're no longer the familiar attachment figure that they have been. And so it will take time for them to rebuild that relationship. And of course, it's the teacher and the teacher assistant who need to put the effort into recreating that relationship by tuning in to the children, really. So I'll continue with this list. They might say or imply that they don't need them anymore, or become sort of pseudo-independent, or not be able to ask for help. And the signs that they're struggling may be very subtle, just like turning away, or not replying, or running away a little bit. Or it might come out in their play. With the little ones, hopefully they will have a lot of opportunity to play. And this is one of the ways that children can work through these anxieties. And so if staff can tune into their play communications about characters in their play struggling or not being able to fix things together, or things falling apart, or maybe car crashes in the sand or something like that. Maybe anxieties about losing things, little problems in school may become much bigger and cause bigger reactions than they used to in the past. More easily triggered outbursts. So the vulnerable children may have had outbursts already, but these will possibly be more easily triggered and longer. And so they'll need more understanding, more practical support. I don't know what the rules are going to be about with the little ones, whether adults are going to be able to touch and comfort them. You might know a little bit about that.
I think different schools will interpret the guidance in different ways, and I know that some have interpreted it as such that if a child, for example, falls over and scrapes their knee, they'll need to put on PPE before they're able then to attend to that child, and that's bringing up, understandably, all sorts of anxieties, because our natural inclination will like be that we want to rush over and
or if they're crying.
Mm.
Or if they're difficult to connect with. I think they really need to know that we care about them. Somebody said to me the other day, as a way of showing that you really want to give them a hug, but it's difficult, is to actually hug yourself really tightly like this and say, if you can do that and you can imagine that it's me hugging you, then you can know that I really want to hug you and make you feel better, and I know how hard it is. You can use words and demonstrate actions. Of course, it would be much better if you could really comfort them. Another thing which may be difficult is less tolerance of frustration. They may find little things which didn't bother them before much more difficult to cope with and give up and storm off, etc. And then they regress learning. They may not be able to manage either to concentrate or to do the sort of things which they previously were able to do. And so they'll have to go back. The teachers will need to have different expectations, and maybe to concentrate more on emotional aspects, and to feel okay about this, because I was thinking about adults when they've finished their education, maybe they've got a degree or something and they're out in the workplace. A really big factor in the success of somebody in the adult world is emotional intelligence. It's not just the qualifications we have. Emotional intelligence is crucially important. And so you could see this time as an opportunity to really develop that. And I'm imagining lots of circle time. Circle time's been around for years, and it's particularly useful at this time. And one way that it's useful is for children who can't manage to join in, who are feeling very reluctant, maybe even scared, or just not used to having conversations with people outside the family, not being able to join in. They can listen to other children sharing their feelings, and they can do it, of course, through puppets and toys, and the teacher could model it. And some children will be able to talk about the things that they're worried about and the things that they find difficult, etc., and their experiences perhaps. And then other children will be able to listen to this and gradually gain the confidence. Well, firstly, they will experience that one can talk about it, because not all homes will be able to talk about things. Only some families are able to talk openly, and only some families are sufficiently attuned to their children. And also only some adults can cope with their own anxieties enough that they are available for the children. One of the things that I heard recently when I was at a meeting was, I already know about the need for what's called emotional containment. So this is the adult's capacity to bear what the child puts into them, to bear the child's anxiety, to bear the child's upset, to bear the child's anger even, or even hatred, because some children will act out in quite a severe way. So to contain it and not to immediately respond, but to contain it and to have a brief time when one can stop and think. It may only be a second, or later perhaps to talk to somebody else and wonder how one could respond to situations like that, but also to be able to contain it. And so children need the availability of a caring, significant adult, someone, in other words, that they can trust and they have trusted, who's got what's described as an uncluttered mind. Now, this doesn't mean that you're not going to have your own anxieties and your own thoughts at times. But when you're in school, and teachers have always been very good at this. I mean, I remember one of the positive things about teaching is that you have to be in the present moment, especially with the little ones. It's an opportunity to be completely in the present moment. And so I think children need more than ever adults who are available and who have not got things on their mind which are getting in the way of them being tuned to the very subtle communications that some children might be giving over. And sometimes this might not be possible. And so we don't have to feel like we're a failure if this is difficult. Very often hopefully there will be two adults in the room, and school staff can swap roles and take a break and have a cup of tea, or they can suggest that the whole class have a little break and do a little bit of jumping around perhaps, or a little bit of... And another thing I was thinking was about regulation. I think regulation of emotions and behaviour is going to be more difficult at this time. And there are some ways that you can practice it. You can use music, you can use dance, you can use exercise, you can use, even in a circle time, you can, or I don't know if they would be allowed to hold hands, but they could lift up their hands and make a noise. Perhaps there used to be a game called Zoom. I don't know if you remember it. The Zoom goes around the circle. So one child says zoo, the next one says zoo, and it goes all around the circle, and then gradually it gets quieter and quieter and quieter, and then it stops. So practicing regulation is about lifting the state through music, or even dance, or noise, or words, and then letting it go down. And it's important to have the time of peace and quiet at the end. And this is actually the way that parents help their babies, maybe not so much babies, toddlers and little ones, with self-regulation in the early days. You know, you have an exciting time with children, you play and roll on the grass and lift them up, and then you have a quiet cuddle to help them down again. Now, some children won't have had this, but it's possible to give it to them in school, and maybe that's needed particularly at this time. And then to understand the sort of practical fears that they might be scared of going outside, for example. I've certainly noticed this in my grandchildren, and I know in other children that they've been so used to just staying inside, or maybe staying in the garden if they're lucky enough to have a garden, that going outside into the playground is going to bring up a lot of anxieties. And so they might need to have some sort of alternative arrangement, or do it in small steps. This is another thing about in small doses. There's a famous psychologist, Donald Winnicott, whom I'm sure you've heard of, who used to talk about doing things in small doses. And particularly at this time, children may only be able to manage a few words, a short time, with a task perhaps, a very short time. Using timers can be helpful. And this is another thing about nurture groups. One of the things about nurture groups is that they do things in very short amounts of time. I've forgotten how they used to describe it, but you have a task which only lasts a short time and then another one. Not all children will need this. And I suppose the advantage of children going back in small groups is that you're more able to be tuned in to the needs of each individual time. And this brings me back on to something else, which is, and this is how I was trained actually all those years ago in the Plowden era, which is to be child-centred. Teachers will have more opportunity, and it will be more important to be child-centred, and maybe to let different children respond in their different ways. Some of them will be open to learning. Some of them may actually want to escape to reading a book or to doing a task which they can manage. And others of them will find it very difficult to settle down, to be still, to concentrate, to get started. Getting started might be difficult, because this time of going back to school is like a new start. So it's going to arouse anxieties about getting started. And I don't know how much time I've got. Can I go on to something else?
Please, Angela, please do. It's all very important and really interesting. Thank you.
Because something I wanted to bring up was about teachers supporting each other, and about a way of reflecting together. I wonder if I can find it. A way of reflecting together on a behaviour which the child is obviously indicating something and you're not sure what it is. So this is something which I have in the book and which I've used often with teachers. which is to look at, it's sort of about observing, which is why I was so keen to call this session Watch, Wait and Wonder, because it's about watching. So observation, and in child psychotherapy training, observation is a crucial aspect. I observed both a baby and a nursery child for a year each. And so the teachers can observe, and maybe with the smaller numbers, there's a little bit more time to observe. So it's about watching, noticing and remembering a particular behaviour, then describing it to other staff who you're with and who are able to support you. It's particularly helpful if you can have somebody who's got some sort of training like yourself to be there to help give a helpful context. And then,
before you continue, can I just mention, because that Watch, Wait and Wonder comes from a particular programme.
It does, yes, I should have mentioned that. Yes, it comes from a programme of which is a sort of mother-toddler psychotherapy programme, which is where the mother is encouraged to watch the child for a period and to play with the child if necessary. In other words, to be with the child and respond to the child's needs for a period of about half an hour. And then the child is looked after by somebody, and the parent and the therapist talk about the play communications and the communications generally, and wonder what the child might be feeling, thinking, etc. So this is sort of transferring that into the school setting and asking, what feelings did the child seem to be expressing in this behaviour which we're wondering about? And then also, what feelings did he put into you? Because one of the things that happens in school anyway, even if you don't understand it, is children, especially very distressed or disturbed or needy children, can put very powerful feelings into the adults who are with them. And this could, without, if you don't realise what's happening, you can easily react and, say, come along, it's all right, you don't have to worry about that. Rather than actually realising this is a communication from the child. So wondering what the feelings did the child evoke in you, and then how did you feel pushed to respond? I mean, the helpful thing is if you're aware of that, you may feel pushed to react and to say, don't worry, you don't need to worry, or to deny, or to try and say, pull yourself together, or to say you need a bit of time out, which is not engaging. And all these things may not be the best thing in the circumstances. They may be, but to stop and think, or maybe to talk about it with your colleagues. And another thing is that children can press your buttons as an adult, which you can be aware of or not aware of, because we all have our own vulnerabilities from our own history. And it's nothing to be ashamed of, it's just that everybody has a history and everybody has areas which can become vulnerable and pressed, and then we can find it more difficult to access our uncluttered mind, as it were. And so if we can talk about this in a small group with other staff, then we can wonder how could we respond better in this situation? Having done the sort of beginning work in understanding the feelings they're communicating, understanding what they're putting into us, and understanding our own vulnerabilities, and then talking it through, we can then find perhaps a more helpful way to respond next time, or to other children, or just generally become more thoughtful and reflective as practitioners and teachers. And I think this is wonderful, because it's not just helpful for the individual child or for the next child that you have problems with, but it's helpful generally to your work as a teacher or as a teacher assistant. So the last question might be, if something similar happened again, how might you respond?
And that's predicated on spaces for reflection, Angela, and
it
what's
does. It does.
you give around that in terms of teaching staff, teachers finding those reflective spaces and finding reflective others with which to have sorts of conversations and wonderings with.
Yeah, and this will be a whole school issue, of course, and it will also require the managers and the school leaders to value this and to see this actually as a growth opportunity for everyone, because I think that this chance to have less children in your class and this very real difficulty which we all face can make it okay for everybody to struggle, and okay for everybody to need a little bit more time to think And actually this could be, in fact, I have heard of some schools that are going to prioritise just helping the children to manage their feelings over learning, because they feel that, because you can't learn actually if you're not secure. And if you do, and this is one of the things, is creating a secure base in your classroom. You probably haven't got a time to think about that anymore, but just wondering if there's anything. Well, I could talk about an example of when I was able to reflect with a teacher about a child who had difficulties. Do you think that's a good idea? I noticed there was a question that was possible.
And then we have, perhaps we could have a little a thought about that, and then we have some reflections and questions here. It would be lovely to share with you, Angela.
Right. Well, this is not actually about coronavirus. This is about a behaviour which was repeated every day, which was very difficult for the teacher to understand, which was that the child had extreme difficulty coming into school. He would scream and struggle, and his mum was there, and his mum was very anxious, and he was very anxious. And the school took this seriously, and they had somebody, the same person every day, who would help the child come in, and he would be brought in through a veil of tears, and then he would come into the classroom, and then he just could not settle in the classroom. This was a young child, he was about 6, I think, and so there were various things on the table for the children to do, and he couldn't settle to anything. It took about 15 minutes, and eventually he would settle, and then he would be fine for the rest of the day. So I discussed this with the teacher. And first of all, we thought about, was he a resistant ambivalent child? Because there's an attachment pattern which has features of extreme difficulty with separation. And there's very good reasons for this. But this pattern includes being resistant to tasks generally, and includes being very ambivalent in relationships. And this child wasn't displaying that. So we were still struggling to understand. And then we wondered about the difficulty with beginnings. And then the teacher remembered that a conversation in the staff room about how these children had a very difficult birth. In fact, it was so difficult. He was in intensive care for several weeks, and it was feared that he might die. He was on all sorts of tubes and things, and he very nearly died. And so this created huge anxiety in the mother and the family, and also in the baby, although the baby wouldn't have known the anxiety, because hormones would have been zipping around, and his mother wasn't able to comfort him. And so then we understood that possibly this difficulty with beginnings in school was a repeat of that anxiety, particularly as the mother herself was so anxious. So then the teacher, after the conversation, was able to have a chat with the mother about this, and then she could understand that too. She could say, well, this makes sense, maybe it is that. And so later on they were able to have a conversation with the child, reassuring the child that, there's a good reason for it. It's not to do with you. It's not to do with, nobody could help it, but it's over now. You're healthy, you're well. There isn't a difficulty coming into school, and you don't need to worry. But we do understand that this may be coming up in your body, because these sorts of very early memories are actually stored in the body. You probably know quite a lot about that. And so if the child who was 6 could begin to understand, and particularly the mother, could be less anxious, because she could realise it wasn't to do with her not managing him well now. It was to do with what was arising within her because of the beginning anxiety. Anyway, this was very helpful. And eventually, it took a couple of months, I guess. Slowly it got better. And he settled absolutely fine. And the teacher, I remember I met him quite a while afterwards, and he was able to say that he observed the child. I think it was the following year, and he was really settled, and there wasn't the same problem. So it can make a big difference, thinking together.
And wondering together, and being truly open and truly curious about what might be going on.
Yes.
And you speak a lot in your book, Angela, about acknowledging before offering. So first we acknowledge the feelings and the sensations, the somatic things that we might notice. The way the body is expressing some of the distress that might not be coming out linguistically or verbally, and then the wonder about and offer possible solutions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that acknowledging internally, isn't it? Because in my book I've got it, ACO, acknowledge the difficulty, communicate whatever it is you need to communicate, and then offer help. But you're putting it in more of an internal thing, acknowledging yourself. So putting yourself into into that understanding for a few minutes, feeling okay about acknowledging, I guess. So it's both internal and external and communicating it. Yeah. Thank you.
And in terms of staff members supporting each other, because it's a tall order, isn't it? All of these things that staff are expected to do at this time, are expected to do anyway, and
Yeah.
particularly additionally at this time. Can that knowledge, communicate, offer be part of the communication between members of staff in education settings and
Yes, I think one of the problems has been that lots of teachers, I mean, they're highly qualified, you know, they've got degrees, some of them have even got higher degrees and done extra training. They're very capable. And so they're used to thinking, you know, I can manage, this is my job, I know how to manage. And when they have a child that really gets to them, then, you know, they can use the trial and tested ways of rewards and maybe even encouragement and maybe even threat that you can't do this until you've done that, you know, and being very firm. And it's very difficult sometimes for teachers to think they need to ask for help. And it's not a weakness to need to ask for help. I know of schools where they think of it as a sign of strength to ask. In fact, I think it's a sign of emotional strength to be able to say, look, it's really difficult. I'm struggling. Have you got any thoughts? Would you have a few minutes that we could just talk this through? And I think that's a sign of emotional maturity, really. And it doesn't mean that you're not highly qualified and you haven't got lots of skills and strengths. It's just, this is how we learn, actually, by talking through mistakes, both as adults, and we all know that children learn through their mistakes, but also as adults. It's not even mistakes. Talking through difficulties is a way of learning. But I do understand that in some schools, and maybe some managers give over, you know, that teachers are expected to cope, and it's respect, and it's important to respect that, but also to be available. I don't know how they would structure that into their school day or into what teachers do, but I do see this time, certainly until the end of this term, and I think it's going to need to continue in the next term as well, as an opportunity to bring these things more to the fore, and for schools to think seriously about how we can support each other for the sake of the children, and to help children to grow, because the children also, through this additional talking through and playing through, and I think because we're thinking of the little ones, especially at this time, playing through is going to be especially important, both symbolic play and something which I call attachment-based play, which I do also talk about in the book, which is, and there's even a version of this for parents to use with older children called TheraPlay, which you may have heard of and you can train in, but it's about fun and laughter together, eye contact. I mean, it is also about touch, which may be difficult, like row, row, row the boat, you know, having fun together and lots of eye contact. But you can do it with ball games, with balloons and with bubbles. And I'm thinking about the bubbles, which have been talked about. So you could use bubbles as a way of developing laughter, but then you need to come down as well. So in the attachment-based play is the going up. I think Margot Sunderland talks about it as high intensity relational moments, which I think is a lovely description. But then the adult brings the child or the children down. And that brings me a little bit to the use of silence. And I think silence and times of quiet, and I know you're very skilled and a teacher of yoga, especially yoga, and I think this could be incorporated into yoga, but there's also mindfulness, just having short periods of quiet. And I think with older children, putting their heads on their desks for a few moments, maybe listening to the sound of a gong, which lasts about half a minute or even a minute if it's a longer one. Maybe watching sand go through a sand filter. These things can be very helpful for children to develop the capacity. And of course, vulnerable children will find it difficult. But it is possible. And I've had experiences of introducing mindfulness to whole classes with some very vulnerable children in them, but each one has an adult looking out for them. And it worked, actually, because the adult was there who they trusted and who was next to them and near to them. It did work. And so this is an opportunity to encourage that.
And I think part of it, Angela, is this idea that it doesn't have to be necessarily for some children and young people sitting still with their eyes closed, looking serene. I remember one session I was leading a guided visualization with a group of young
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
One of them was literally spinning in circles in the corner, like continued. And there was one part of the visualization where I was asking them to imagine exhaling into a big balloon. And I said, "What colour is your balloon?" And this child spinning in the corner said, "Purple." And I said, "You're completely with me.
Yeah.
You're completely
Yeah.
with me in this." And I would never have guessed he was even listening.
Yeah.
So trusting the process, trusting that children and young people will find their way in. And those
Yeah.
moments of silence actually might be even by the children and young people who seem to resist it the most.
Yes, yes, yes. I think it depends on the adult and what you can cope with. And I have heard, I mean, I know of a very successful creative visualization session, which is done actually daily in a school. And there was one child that really couldn't cope with it. And so this was only one out of, there used to be about 50 who came every day. And so it was decided that this child should have individual sessions because it was disturbing the other children. So I do take what you say, but some teachers and some adults may find that impossible to cope with. So I think we need to be gentle on ourselves and do what we can do and find ways. Yeah, it's not about exclusion. It's maybe about finding alternatives.
That's it.
Yeah. Working slowly, small doses.
Yeah. Beautifully, uniquely different, aren't we? And yet we share
Yes, we all have different strengths to share. Yeah.
Angela, I have a few little comments here that we'll finish on.
Okay.
Some people reflecting on the emotions surrounding the quick changes and uncertainty of the current situation, in particular for children who may have siblings returning, but they are not currently allowed to go back.
Yeah.
The impact that this might have on the family and the choices they make. So it could be that a child in reception is going back, but their year 4 sibling is remaining at home.
Yes.
And the that might create. Tricky.
Yeah. It is. It is. I mean, I think a sensitive parent who is aware of that will possibly also have some thoughts about how they can comfort the child, because obviously that's very difficult. I actually know of a family like this, and the younger child who is not going back, the older one is year 6, so he is going back, and he's delighted to be going back because he's going to be able to say goodbye to his friends before he moves on to secondary. And the younger one is distraught and crying and crying and crying. And I think you can only be a comforting mum really in those situations, putting things into words, understanding, adjusting, acknowledging all the things that we've talked about, and wondering and finding other ways to comfort them, and maybe easing your expectations. I mean, it might be helpful to do more schoolwork, it might be helpful to do less, just responding. But the more difficult thing will be if the parents are working full time. And I also know families where parents have to work full time. They've got a full commitment, and so they can't be available for the children. And this is extremely difficult. They just have to find the opportunities and the breaks to talk this through and acknowledge with them. I think maybe that's not very helpful, but I just know it will be very difficult, and we can't pretend otherwise. The other child possibly could walk up to the school and meet them. I don't know whether there was a way that teachers could contact the children. I do know of schools where teachers are contacting their children, or some teachers are contacting children on a daily basis, particularly the vulnerable ones. And that doesn't just mean those who are under social care, but all the ones that they consider might need it. They're phoning them up, and that might be something that schools could do, because this is going to be an added difficulty. I think the whole of the return is going to be an added difficulty, but also an added opportunity, because there's going to be this change, then there's going to be another change when everybody goes back, then there might be different ways of organising. And so the secure base is going to be quite difficult to maintain in those circumstances. But those circumstances are also opportunities of talking through and acknowledging how we need to feel safe. In fact, the use of the word safe is one thing that I recommend for all people who work with vulnerable children, especially those who are what I describe as chaotic disorganized, which are really the ones who've had the most trauma in their history. To talk about, my job is to keep you safe. I can't let you do that because it's not safe. We need to keep everyone safe here. Just to use the word safe frequently can be very helpful.
Thank you.
You might have ideas.
I was just reflecting as you were speaking how that there'll be constant shifts, and the transition will itself shift over time as different cohorts of children return, and therefore maybe that if there are even a few key things, a handful of key things that somehow remain stable, somehow remain in some semblance the same to support that containment. And that might be something as simple as the words children are used to be greeted in the morning, or a punctuation point in their day, such as a mindfulness 5 minutes that remains regardless of any other changes in the timetable. Mentioning virtual tours, and that some schools are creating video tours to support children and young people to have a sense of not only what the school might look like if they're transitioning to a new school, but also what their classroom might look like if, for example, it's been stripped, for want of a better word, of many of the resources that they might have been used to being there before, or if the desks are positioned differently. So I guess it's supporting them to have an image in mind of what they'll be walking into.
One of the things that needs to stay the same is the people, the relationships. So if there's an adult who previously worked with a very vulnerable child, it would be good, if possible, if that adult could remain the same. And also, if it's decided that an adult will support a particular child, if that could remain, not swapping from one adult to another. Some children will cope with this, but some children really need to have the same person that they can begin to trust, or the same few people.
This idea of a family of key adults, that if actually one member of staff therefore cannot be there for whatever reason, that there are others that can step in.
Yeah, but not just swapping them over without thinking seriously about the effect on the child.
Thank you, Angela. And we'll finish, we have a bit of a longer comment here, so we'll finish on this one. And this is somebody talking about this conversation in light of the Wait, Watch and Wonder theme. Thinking about following the transition back to school, wondering how long schools might allow for children to adapt and settle into the new systems, routines, curriculums, and general day-to-day experience before academic goals and pressures become the focus. I'm hoping that mental health and well-being will remain a key focus for at least the rest of the academic year, and hopefully beyond, with an exclamation mark. The question here is, how long do you think schools should implement a recovery type curriculum whilst this focus is being placed on the emotional well-being and support of the children and young people?
Well, I think that sort of thing should be in people's minds the whole time. It's difficult for me to say. I think each case will be different. And I think it's just something that schools and school staff need to take seriously. Of course, it will go on. I've heard of one school where the children are going back for a fortnight, and then a different group of children are going back for a fortnight, then another group of children are going back for a fortnight. And this may be helpful, but it may be not helpful, because some children will just beginning to be managed, finding a secure base, and then it's gone. So it's going to depend on the school and on the individual children. I don't know that I can talk in a blanket way about it, really, except it needs to be taken seriously. What I would like to hope is that schools as a whole, as the person who's just commented said, will take mental health more seriously and will have it on the agenda all the time. In fact, one of the schools I know, they have nurture on the agenda every staff meeting, which doesn't mean they talk about it, but they just say, is there anything we need to bring up about nurture this time? And then they have 5 minutes perhaps. And I would think that that would be very helpful, or anything we need to bring up about anxiety, whatever relating to adjustment, return.
Very much alive and on the agenda.
Because one of the things which children find particularly difficult, children who've had difficult transitions, some children have had multiple transitions. They're in the care system. They've been whipped out of their home from their point of view very suddenly without expecting it. Good reasons perhaps, but it hasn't been discussed with them. Then they're in foster care, then suddenly they're moved to another. So they will find transitions particularly difficult. And this time is going to be a time of multiple transitions, which is going to evoke big anxieties in some children, but it's also going to be a time when we can practice talking through transitions before they happen. And this has always been one of my concerns about schools, that they're not bringing up the anxieties related to an upcoming transition early enough, particularly with some children. some children need less time, and nursery children are probably in the present moment most of the time, so probably need less time because they think it's tomorrow if you start talking about it. But generally, to have plenty of time to talk through the anxieties, but the practicalities as well. And I think your idea of a virtual tour of the school and talking through what we're coming back to is very helpful and very practical. But also picking up on cues that children are anxious about the upcoming transition, which may be any of those behaviours which I talked about. And also in my book, there's a list of indicators that a child is finding a forthcoming transition difficult. So that the ones I can't remember offhand what they might be, is I don't need you anymore, for example. So any of these behavioural communications should be noticed. So this is watching, and then waiting, stopping, in other words, and reflecting, and then wondering how we can respond, and taking the opportunity to respond. Now, teachers might think, oh, I've got to teach the class, but it's only small doses. It's one comment, and then a little bit of time, maybe a break for the child, and then carry on with whatever they're doing. So it's about the child being heard. Why can't you hear me? This is what they need. They need to feel, even though they may not be aware that they need to feel heard, because some of them might be anxious about relationships anyway, but we all need to feel heard and acknowledged.
For sure we do.
Yeah.
And I feel that this morning you've heard and acknowledged all the comments and reflections and questions, and heard and acknowledged the wider anxieties that might be in existence at the moment, Angela. And I think so much of your book that's relevant now in this current situation around the transition, and around really placing an emphasis and highlighting and holding up aspects of emotional health and well-being for children and for ourselves as well. So we can't thank you enough for coming along this morning, and we wish everybody here a good start to the week, and we're in solidarity with you very, very much so.